Hello everyone, how's it going? In this video, I wanted to go ahead and show you how to make this exact scene right in front of you using Blender. This is going to be targeted towards Blender beginners as well as intermediate users, and we are going to be starting off of a base mesh. We are mainly going to be focusing on establishing a very quick workflow using extremely simple techniques to have a nice environment and extremely nice lighting as well. All of the necessary assets are linked down below, so follow along. We are starting with this base mesh downloaded off of the SketchUp 3D warehouse made by this kind man. Go ahead and download the SketchUp file and import it into Blender using the SketchUp import option. After which you want to select every major object, press Shift L, select linked by material. After which you want to press Ctrl J in order to merge every object that has the same material into a single object. We've done this for anything that has this brick facade, anything that has metal, as well as a glass. As you can see, the mesh itself is quite clean and neat. So let's start by taking a look at the actual materials. You might try to go ahead and clean up the mesh, but in this case, it would be best not to, as you could see in front of you. As you could see, we are using an extremely simple PBR workflow by using an albedo map, color map, a roughness map, as well as a normal or bump map. This is downloaded off of Quixel Bridge called Brick Facade. Go ahead and download it as a 4K image and import it into Blender. Make sure to fix the shading as well. And in my case, I wanted to actually stretch it a little bit so it's a bit longer. This is how it looks by default. And if I stretch it by around 2.2, 2.5 maximum, we can get off with it without any noticeable distortion of the actual texture. It helps that we have a 4K image as well. For the glass, it's simply a principled BSDF with the roughness set to 0, as well as the transmission set to 1. And add in a volume absorption inside of the volume slot. Our pavement is really simple as well. Simple albedo map, as well as a roughness map and a bump or normal map. Our wood is even simpler. We are only using an albedo map, plugging it into a color ramp, plugging this color ramp into the roughness, and a different color map plugged into a bump map into the normal slot. Now our water shader is just as simple as well. A simple glass material. You can add some volume absorption, but in this case it didn't matter at all. And you can add a bit of noise in order to emulate the deformation of the actual wind. As you could see, the material is extremely simple. Even for our dirt shader, you can literally just use a solid color and it wouldn't even matter, since you are going to be hiding it with grass anyway. At this point, we have to add our camera. Now for our camera, I'm looking for a really simple, straightforward, let's say, composition. Let's add a simple camera, rotate it until it's looking where we want it to look at, and set the focal length to something like 28, 26. We want the focal length to be a bit wide to have this nice stretching effect. It works in this case, and it makes the house seem way larger as well. Adds more depth in our scene, and all around just looks better than actually using something like 55 millimeters. For our lighting, we are keeping it as simple. We're using a sky texture, playing with the actual rotation, the ozone, in order to get a bluer sky, playing with the elevation as well as the altitude in order to get rid of the baseline, as you could see. You can use an HDRI, but in my case, I prefer the sky texture as it gives me so much control, and I can change the actual lighting on the fly. In this case, we are using AGX. It does change the color profile a fair bit as well. At this point, we already have an okay base to start working off of. Now, the next step would be starting to populate our scene with certain assets, right? Now, before doing that, you have to select everything, do Control A, apply the scale, and typically would add grass first, but in this case, I am going to be adding our shrubs first and leaving the grass till later on during the scene making stage. That way the scene remains a bit more responsive since grass tends to make the scene way more heavy. So as you can see, I'm just playing around with these shrubs models that I have from the Botaniq add-on. Really nice assets and well optimized. Added a couple of trees. Now just trying to populate the scene as much. Generally, I would do this in a more well thought of approach. I will have some references near me. I will go ahead and analyze a base image, see how the tree line works, right? Play with the colors, add a couple of variations inside of the color and of the actual trees, maybe add a couple of tree species that work together, and just all around being more mindful of the actual scene, right? We want a nice ecosystem that works. In this case, the scene took me around 30 minutes to make, and it would take a lot of time showing this process from scratch on a short YouTube video. Hopefully in the future, once I have a bit more leverage, I will be going ahead and sharing a large series which will go over this process in a timely fashion, right? As you could see, I am just going ahead and scattering our trees here. Ideally, you will want to have at least 5 or 6 trees with 2 species at least that work together. The more time you spend during this process, the more interesting the actual trees would look like. As you could see, you might notice that I am actually adding some trees and deleting them yet again. After which, I want to cast some shadows on these trees. They look way too bright, so I'm going to be adding a light blocker plane. Go ahead and play with its location and see how it affects the actual shadows onto the scene. Now, this light blocker by itself blocks too much light. I want some light seeping through, so I want to add a noise map inside of the actual alpha, right? So add a noise map, play with it until it kind of makes sense. Add a color ramp in order to give it much more contrast. That way the opaque areas are very opaque and the transparent areas are transparent, allowing the light to seep through and get blocked in certain areas as well. And the nice thing is that Blender is extremely responsive. So as you could see, I am able to see the effects this node is doing on the fly. Extremely helpful in look dev and honestly amazing. We don't want to see this, so we are going to go to our object properties, add into the visibility and disable the in camera. That way we can see it in the camera, however it is still casting the shadows that we wanted to cast. As I mentioned earlier, you might see me adding trees and deleting them again. I'm just going ahead and trying what works and what doesn't. For these scenes, I have decided to not actually do the scene prior to the video, but to do it all in front of you so you can kind of see the thought process of this scene. I am adding a bit of grass, right? So this grass comes from the Bagaply assets. You can use something like glow plants. You can also try something like Max Tree as well. They all have amazing assets. As you can see, I just added this, but I decided then that it's not working as I wanted to. Don't be afraid to delete it. Sometimes you have to let go of things that hurt your scene more than improve them. Even if it takes you so much time to go ahead and work on or create. If it doesn't work, it just doesn't. Get rid of it or keep it for a different project where you can use this a bit more. And in a scenario where it actually helps you. As you can see, I'm trying a couple and I have settled on this nice shrub. At this point, I want to add our grass. So I want to go to edit mode, scale by a factor of 10%, right? So it's 0.1. That way, once I add our grass, the scene doesn't crash. I can always go back to edit mode and scale it by 10, and it's going to come back to the way it used to be and should be, right? This is just a nice technique which I use a lot in order to avoid any form of crashing, especially since some biomes in the Grassblade add-on or Grasscape, I'm not quite sure what it's named, excuse me, generally doesn't add any form of proxies or visibility optimization, so it literally just adds the actual real geometry full on, which, if you have a large surface, would crash your device. As you can see, I'm just applying our nice optimization with the visibility using a proxy mesh. As well as enabling the camera optimization with some FOV boost as well. Once we have optimized our grass setup, we can go ahead to edit mode and scale it by 10 again, and it looks just as it's supposed to. Let's go ahead and visualize this in render mode, and it seems quite solid already. So we want to go ahead and do the same thing for our nice mulch section here. So you want to go ahead to your G-Scatter add-on again, and you don't have to use G-Scatter, you can use the regular particle system, or you can use the geometry node, and it's going to give you the same result, although it's going to take a bit of time, right? So I'm using this nice mulch 10 biome, and it's going to give me a really nice effect as well. If we zoom in, looks quite solid, good enough for me in this case. And at this point, you can start polishing your scene, perhaps maybe adding some interior context, and just all around trying to improve the general look of the scene and making it look less empty. Make sure not to fall into the mistake of making everything a bit too noisy, so not too much information. Follow the rule of 60%, 30%, 10%, and try to go ahead and be mindful of where you add details. So just don't add details for the sake of adding them. Add them where they serve a purpose, right? Now at this point, our lighting seems a bit too bluish, right? So I'm going to be lowering the saturation and moving it aside and duplicating it in order to change the lighting override of the actual visibility. So let's add a mix node or mix shader, right? And add a in-camera ray or light path, light path node. After adding the light path node, you want to plug the is-camera ray inside of the mix factor of the mix shader. Now I want to up the saturation so I have a much bluer sky, maybe lower the value, possibly. You can even play with the hue if that's what you want. This is entirely up to you. Just make sure to not overdo it unless you really want a stylized look, which is, knock yourself out. As you can see, I am slightly up with the sun intensity in order to get a harsher sun. I can probably lower the strength over the general background as well, but in this case it seems quite fine already. The lighting looks solid enough, however I think that it needs a bit of warmth into the image, right? Now we can go ahead and do this with the actual lighting, or we can go ahead and do this with Photoshop. But as you can see, I am also playing with the look under the view transform under the color management section here. I'm using Punchy with AGX and setting the exposure to 1, effectively adding a fair bit of contrast. Now you can use the compositor or you can use the photographer add-on, which turns the compositor into a nice UI, right? It seems like layers extremely simple to use, right? But in reality, it really is just the node compositor packaged into a nice UI that's really easy to understand. I am setting the white balance to something like 7,500 or 7,000. I will go ahead and up it to 7,500 as we speak. And that seems really, really solid as is. Now at this point, you can unhide every object that you have, and you can take a look at how your scene looks like. How can we improve this? Well, first of all, adding more trees variations, maybe adding some dead leaves, adding some nicer trees inside of the actual walls, right? Spending more time polishing our lighting, polishing our camera, and improving the materials, maybe adding some displacement as well. This is entirely up to you. You are now ready to run a final render. And as you could see, in around 30 minutes, we have a really nice render here, which looks moderately realistic, right, for the amount of time that we spent on it. And in all honesty, quite solid for the amount of time we've given it. If this was helpful for you, remember to subscribe. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop them in the comment section. If it's something a bit more advanced, you can message me on Instagram or through our Discord server as well. And until next time, take care and enjoy yourself.